In a remote desert village where the sun scorched the earth into cracks and the horizon seemed to trap dreams rather than carry them, a young girl named Amina was born into a life defined by scarcity, silence, and struggle. Her family lived in a small mud hut that barely shielded them from the relentless heat during the day and the bone-cutting cold at night. Their meals were often just dry bread soaked in water, and even water itself was a rare commodity that arrived once a week in an old tanker, forcing the villagers to store every drop as though it were liquid gold. Yet despite the harshness surrounding her, Amina carried within her an unexplainable hunger, not for food alone but for something far less tangible. A hunger to learn, to know, to rise beyond the invisible walls of her village. And though she had never seen a doctor in person or even visited a proper school with painted walls and desks, she somehow imagined a life in which she wore a white coat, held instruments she could not yet name, and helped people escape suffering just as she longed to escape her own. But dreams were not easy companions in that village. They were dangerous because they reminded you of what you didn't have, and they were heavy because everyone around her believed they were useless. And so every time she voiced her wish to study, to attend school, or even to own a real book, the adults would laugh softly and shake their heads, saying, "Amina, our girls fetch water, they don't read books. Our girls marry young, they don't become doctors." Yet the more they dismissed her, the deeper her resolve grew, as if their disbelief was fuel rather than fire. And so each day, after helping her mother stitch torn clothes and knead dough for the little bread they could make, she would wander to the village's small, crumbling school, too poor to enroll, too determined to stay away, standing outside its open windows, listening to lessons meant for other children while pretending to sweep the ground so no one would push her away. And when the classes ended, she would collect the discarded chalk pieces and torn notebook pages the students left behind, storing them in a small cloth bag she kept hidden under her sleeping mat, her secret treasure chest of knowledge. As evening fell and darkness devoured their home because they could not afford oil for lamps, she refused to surrender to that darkness. She would walk to the only streetlight at the far edge of the village, a rusty pole that flickered weakly yet to her looked like a beacon calling her forward. And there, sitting cross-legged on the hard ground with insects buzzing around and wind whipping grains of sand into her hair, she would copy numbers, letters, and words over and over, tracing them until they became a part of her memory, until her small fingers grew stiff from the chill of the desert night, until the stars above faded and the first light of dawn forced her to return home to begin another day of labor, chores, and hunger. It was a lonely, exhausting cycle, but she endured because she had silently promised herself that one day she would escape, not just for her own sake, but to show every child in that village that they were not born only to suffer but also to rise. And though she was often mocked by neighbors who said, "Books will not fill your stomach, Amina," she knew deep inside that they might one day fill something even greater, her future. But determination alone could not erase the weight of poverty, and there were nights when her empty stomach growled louder than her thoughts, making the letters blur before her eyes. Yet she would grit her teeth, hold her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, and keep writing because she believed that stopping even for one night would let failure creep in like the cold. Years passed this way, and Amina's persistence slowly carved her into someone stronger than anyone in her village had imagined, strong enough to take the regional school exams despite never having attended proper classes. And when the results came, she had not only passed but ranked high enough to qualify for a government scholarship, a piece of paper that became her ticket out of the desert, and into a city she had only heard about in travelers' stories. The day she left, her father, once skeptical and reluctant, stood silently by the bus, his rough hands trembling as he handed her a bundle of dates and whispered, "Make this worth it," while her mother's tear-streaked face hid both pride and fear. And Amina, clutching her bag filled with patched clothes and a few notebooks, stepped onto that bus feeling as if she were stepping from one world into another, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and hope. The city was overwhelming, buildings taller than anything she had ever imagined, streets that glowed with lights even at midnight, and people who seemed to walk faster, talk sharper, and live in a rhythm she could barely follow. But she reminded herself again and again that she had not survived the desert only to give up here. So while wealthier students attended expensive coaching centers, she studied alone in public libraries, sitting for hours with second-hand books, often skipping meals to afford photocopies, often enduring comments from classmates who mocked her accent, her simple clothes, and her unfamiliarity with urban life. Yet instead of letting their words crush her, she let them sharpen her resolve like a blade. Every night she whispered to herself that pain was temporary but quitting would make it permanent. And so she kept going, exam after exam, sacrifice after sacrifice, until finally the day came when she was accepted into a prestigious medical college, a moment that felt almost unreal to her, as though she were living someone else's life. Her journey there was no easier than the one that had brought her. She lived in a cramped hostel room with peeling paint and no heater in winter, survived on the cheapest food she could find, and washed her clothes by hand late at night to save money. But when lectures ended while others socialized, she would bury herself in anatomy charts, memorize thick textbooks under dim lights, and practice until her hands ached. Knowing that every late night and every sacrifice were stepping stones to the vision she had nurtured since childhood, becoming a doctor who could return to that forgotten village and bring change. There were days she cried silently into her pillow from exhaustion, days she doubted whether she could continue. But every time she thought of stopping, she remembered the streetlight in her village, the girl she had been, and how far she had already come, and that memory pushed her to endure. Years of relentless focus turned her from a shy desert child into a confident, skilled medical graduate, and when she finally held her degree, her name printed in bold letters, she felt as though she were holding proof that persistence could bend reality itself, that no matter where you start, you can choose where to go if you refuse to give up. After graduating with honors, Amina's dedication caught the attention of an international medical program that offered her a fellowship abroad, something she had once considered beyond the limits of her imagination. And as she boarded a plane for the first time in her life, watching the clouds drift below her, she remembered the countless nights she had stared at the sky from the desert floor, whispering prayers into the darkness, and now those same stars seemed to be carrying her higher. In the new country, everything was unfamiliar, the language, the culture, the pace, but she had learned long ago that discomfort was not an enemy. It was a teacher, and she embraced it, spending every waking hour immersed in research, surgeries, and learning from doctors whose skills had once only existed in the pages of borrowed textbooks. Yet even as she rose in her career, she never forgot the weight of the journey behind her, the hunger that had shaped her discipline, the loneliness that had strengthened her resolve, and the girl who had refused to quit even when quitting would have been easier. Over the next few years, her innovative techniques and relentless work ethic earned her recognition on global stages, articles in prestigious medical journals, and invitations to conferences where her name was spoken with respect and admiration. But for Amina, success was never about applause. It was about purpose, about using her position to change lives beyond her own. And so the first thing she did with her newfound resources was to build a medical clinic in her home village. A place where children no longer had to die from treatable illnesses, where mothers no longer had to walk miles for medicine, and where education became a doorway instead of a dream. The day she returned, now a world-renowned doctor, her convoy rolled across the same desert road that had once carried her away as a scared teenager. And as the villagers gathered, people who had once doubted her mocked her or told her to stop dreaming. They now watched her step out, wearing the white coat she had imagined so many years ago, their eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief, pride, and regret. Children ran to her, tugging at her sleeves, mothers wept, fathers bowed their heads, and Amina herself felt her heart swell with a deep, overwhelming emotion as she looked at the same rusty streetlight under which she had once studied, still standing, still flickering faintly, and she touched it gently, whispering a thank you to the light that had been her only ally in the darkest nights. In that moment, she understood that her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to every child sitting in that village with a dream too big for their surroundings, to every soul who believed they were trapped by their circumstances, and to everyone who needed proof that persistence could turn impossible into inevitable. She stayed there for weeks, training local nurses, setting up health programs, and speaking to young girls, telling them that their worth was not defined by the size of their home or the doubts of others but by the strength of their determination. And each night, as she watched the next generation of children studying under that same old streetlight, she realized that the true measure of her success was not in the awards she had won or the titles she carried, but in the fact that she had transformed her pain into hope for others, proving that even the harshest deserts can give birth to flowers if the seed refuses to die.